I sat at the Christmas dinner table, fork halfway to my mouth, when my mother leaned back in her chair with that satisfied smirk I had learned to dread over the years. The candlelight caught the gleam in her eyes as she exchanged a look with my sister across the table. Something was coming. Something bad. My mother cleared her throat and announced that she and my sister had finally sold Grandma's house. She added, with a cruel little laugh, that I was never in the will anyway, so I shouldn't feel bad about it. My sister joined in, saying it was good because I would just waste the money. I set down my fork, took a slow sip of wine, and said as calmly as I could manage that I hoped they would enjoy the cash, since I was the one who had bought the house. The table went completely silent. My mother's face drained of all color. The bomb had been dropped, but this was only the beginning of a nightmare I never saw coming. Let me back up and explain how I got to that moment, because nothing about my family has ever been simple. My name is Chance, and I grew up in Portland, Oregon, in a family that looked normal from the outside but was rotting from the inside. My father left when I was 7 years old, just packed a bag one Tuesday morning and walked out the door while I was eating cereal before school. I remember my mother standing in the kitchen doorway, not crying, not even looking surprised. She just lit a cigarette and told me to finish my breakfast. After my father left, my mother Carol started dating a string of men who had money and no interest in a kid who reminded them that Carol had baggage. She worked as a receptionist at a dental office and spent most of her free time at bars or with whatever boyfriend was currently paying for her dinners. She had no time for me and even less interest in being a mother. That was when my grandmother Helen stepped in and saved my life. Helen was my father's mother, which made her presence in my life even more remarkable, considering her son had abandoned us. She was a retired school teacher who lived in a beautiful craftsman house that had been built in 1923 and had stayed in our family ever since. The house sat on a tree-lined street in the Laurelhurst neighborhood, with a wide front porch, original hardwood floors, and built-in bookshelves in every room. Helen loved that house, the way some people love their children. She picked me up every day after school and brought me to her house. She helped me with homework at the oak dining table that had belonged to her parents. She taught me how to cook simple meals, how to change a tire, how to balance a checkbook. She took me to the library every Saturday and let me check out as many books as I could carry. She went to every school event my mother skipped, which was all of them. She taught me that family was not about biology, but about showing up. My sister Madison was 8 years older than me and had always resented the attention Helen gave me. Madison had been 13 when our father left, old enough to remember the good years before everything fell apart, and she blamed me for his departure in some twisted logic only she understood. She told lies about me constantly, claiming I had stolen money from her purse or broken her things, and my mother always believed her without question. When I was 12, my mother married a man named Gerald who owned a successful contracting business. Gerald had money and a big house in the suburbs, and no patience for a stepson who was not his biological child. He was not cruel exactly, just indifferent, treating me like a piece of furniture that came with the house. Madison loved Gerald because he spoiled her, buying her a new car for her 16th birthday and paying for her expensive private college. Madison married a real estate developer named Trevor when she was 25. Trevor came from money and made more money tearing down old houses and building modern condos and townhouses that looked identical and had no soul. He and Madison lived in a glass and steel house on the west side that probably cost more than most people made in a lifetime. Over the years, Madison and my mother grew closer, united by their love of expensive things and their shared disdain for me. They talked constantly about property values and investments and designer brands. They visited Grandma Helen only when they needed money, which was often despite their wealth, because people who love money never have enough of it. I visited Grandma Helen every single week without fail. I mowed her lawn in the summer and raked leaves in the fall. I brought her groceries and helped her clean the gutters. But more than that, I just spent time with her. We would sit on her front porch in the evenings, and she would tell me stories about growing up during the Depression, about teaching in Portland schools for 35 years, about the neighborhood before it became fashionable and expensive. She taught me what it meant to have integrity, to work hard, to value people over possessions. When Grandma Helen died 6 months ago at the age of 87, I felt like someone had reached into my chest and torn out my heart. She had been the only person in my family who loved me unconditionally, who saw value in me beyond what I could provide. I took a week off work and could barely function. At the funeral, I cried until I had no tears left. My mother and Madison did not cry at the funeral. They stood by the casket in expensive black dresses and received condolences with somber faces, but I saw them in the parking lot afterward discussing the house. Madison was already talking about what the property was worth and how quickly they could get it on the market. My mother was nodding along, calculating numbers in her head. I assumed Grandma Helen had left the house to all of us, or maybe to charity. She had never discussed her will with me and I had never asked. It felt wrong to think about her money when all I wanted was her back. 3 weeks after the funeral, I received a letter from an attorney named Philip Morrison, requesting a private meeting at his office downtown. I went on my lunch break, confused and curious. Philip was an older man with kind eyes and a firm handshake. He sat me down in his wood-paneled office and slid a folder across his desk. Inside was Grandma Helen's last will and testament. She had left me everything: the house, all her possessions, and a trust fund I had no idea existed. The trust was not enormous, but it was substantial, enough to make a real difference in my life. I sat there staring at the papers, unable to process what I was reading. Philip explained that Helen had created this will 10 years earlier and had never told anyone about it. She had updated it twice since then, both times reinforcing her wishes. With the will was a handwritten letter addressed to me. My hands shook as I opened it. In her familiar slanted handwriting, Grandma Helen wrote that she was leaving everything to me because I was the only one who had loved her for who she was, not for what she had. She wrote that she knew Madison and my mother would fight over the house and try to sell it immediately to the highest bidder. She knew Trevor would tear it down and build something modern and soulless in its place. She made me promise to protect the house from being sold and destroyed. She wanted it to stay in the family, to be preserved as a piece of Portland history. She wrote that the house had sheltered 3 generations of our family and deserved to shelter more. The letter went on to explain why she had made this decision. 10 years earlier, my mother had come to visit Helen with a stack of brochures for retirement communities. Carol had spent 2 hours trying to convince Helen to sell the house and move into assisted living. She claimed it was for Helen's own good, that the house was too big for one person, that Helen could not maintain it properly at her age. But Helen knew the truth. Carol wanted access to the money. She wanted Helen to sell the house so Carol could inherit the proceeds sooner rather than later. Helen had been devastated by the betrayal, by the realization that her daughter-in-law saw her as an obstacle to wealth rather than as a person deserving of dignity and choice. Helen had refused to sell. After Carol left that day, Helen had called Philip Morrison and made an appointment to ensure her will was ironclad. She had been protecting her house and protecting me ever since. I sat in Philip's office with tears running down my face, clutching that letter like a lifeline. Philip gave me time to compose myself, then explained the legal process. The will needed to go through probate, which would take several months. During that time, I was to keep the inheritance confidential until all the legal paperwork was finalized. I left his office in a daze, grateful and heartbroken and overwhelmed. I decided to wait to tell my family until after probate was complete and everything was official. I wanted to honor Grandma Helen's wishes properly, and I needed time to figure out how to handle the responsibility she had given me. I kept the inheritance secret for 2 weeks, going about my normal life and trying to process everything that had changed. I worked my job as a civil engineer for the city of Portland, reviewing construction permits and infrastructure projects. It was steady work that paid decently and that I found meaningful. I had a small apartment in southeast Portland and drove a 6-year-old truck that ran well enough. Then my mother called. Her voice had that sharp edge that meant she was angry about something and had decided it was my fault. She demanded I come to a family meeting at her house that Sunday. When I asked what it was about, she said I would find out when I got there and hung up. I knew immediately this was trouble. My family never held meetings unless someone wanted something or was angry about something, and usually both. I thought about making an excuse, but some part of me was curious about what they had planned. I also thought maybe this would be a good time to tell them about the will, now that some time had passed since the funeral. Sunday came, and I drove to my mother's house in the suburbs. It was a large colonial-style house with a manicured lawn and expensive cars in the driveway. Gerald answered the door with barely a nod and gestured toward the living room where my mother and Madison were waiting. The living room looked like something from a magazine, all white furniture and glass tables and abstract art on the walls. Nothing you could actually use without worrying about ruining it. My mother sat in an armchair like a queen on a throne. Madison sat on the couch next to Trevor, who I had not expected to see. Trevor was a tall man with perfect hair and an expensive watch and the kind of smile that made you want to count your fingers after shaking his hand. My mother did not offer me a drink or ask how I was doing. She launched right into it. Madison's husband, Trevor, had discovered through his real estate connections that Grandma Helen's house was now worth over $1 million. The Laurelhurst neighborhood had become one of the most desirable areas in Portland. Young tech workers and California transplants were buying up old houses and either renovating them or tearing them down to build new ones. The property values had skyrocketed. Trevor had already been contacted by 3 different developers who were interested in the land. They would pay top dollar, and the sale could happen quickly. Trevor had done the math, and if they sold to the right buyer, they could clear $900,000 after closing costs and fees. My mother announced they were selling immediately. She said it with the tone of someone informing staff that lunch would be served early, not someone discussing a major family decision. I tried to speak, but Madison cut me off. She said I would get nothing because Grandma Helen was clearly senile at the end and probably forgot to update her will. She said this with such casual cruelty, as if she were commenting on the weather. My mother nodded along, adding that even if Helen had meant to leave me something, it did not matter because as the next of kin, she had rights that superseded any outdated will. Trevor leaned forward, his expensive watch catching the light. He explained that he had already spoken to a lawyer who confirmed that as Helen's daughter-in-law and closest living relative after her son's death, Carol had strong grounds to contest any will that did not adequately provide for her. He said judges almost always sided with mothers over grandchildren in estate disputes because mothers were presumed to have the deceased's best interests at heart. I felt anger rising in my chest. I opened my mouth to tell them about Philip Morrison and the will and the trust fund, but my mother held up her hand to silence me like I was a child interrupting adult conversation. She said they had already taken steps to ensure the process went smoothly. She reached into a folder on the coffee table and pulled out documents. She slid them across to me with a satisfied smile. The documents were power of attorney papers dated 3 months before Grandma Helen's death, giving my mother complete authority over Helen's financial and legal affairs. The signature looked like Helen's shaky handwriting. There was a notary seal and everything. My blood ran cold. I had visited Grandma Helen every week up until her death. She had been sharp as ever, reading the newspaper every morning and doing crossword puzzles and arguing with me about politics. She would never have signed over power of attorney to my mother, especially not after what had happened 10 years ago with the retirement home brochures. Madison saw the expression on my face and smiled. She said her friend Julie, who was a notary, had been kind enough to witness the signing. She said it so casually, but I caught the slight emphasis on the word friend. She was telling me, without quite saying it outright, that the documents were forged. Trevor explained that with the power of attorney, they had the legal right to override any will Helen might have made. They had already filed the documents with the county. Everything was official and legal. I felt like I was drowning. I wanted to scream at them, to tell them they were frauds and liars, but I knew that would accomplish nothing. They had planned this carefully. They had created false documents and filed them with the government, and were now presenting it all as legitimate. I stood up to leave. I could not stay in that room another second without saying something I would regret. My mother called after me, saying we would need to meet with Trevor's lawyer to finalize everything. Madison added that I should not bother trying to fight it because they had resources and connections and I had nothing. I drove home shaking with rage and fear. As soon as I got to my apartment, I called Philip Morrison. It was Sunday evening, but he had given me his cell phone number for emergencies. This was an emergency. Philip listened to everything, and when I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said this was worse than he had thought. If they could successfully argue that the power of attorney was legitimate and that Helen was mentally incompetent when she made her will, they could potentially overturn everything. Proving the power of attorney was forged would be difficult and expensive, and could take months or even years in court. He explained that I would need to hire a probate attorney who specialized in contested estates. It would cost me thousands of dollars in legal fees. Meanwhile, Carol and Madison had the resources of two wealthy husbands backing them. They could drag the case out indefinitely, running up my legal bills until I had no choice but to settle. Philip warned me this would be a war. My family had shown they were willing to commit fraud and perjury. They would not stop unless forced to stop, and forcing them would require time and money and strength I might not have. I thanked Philip and hung up. I sat in my apartment as the sun set outside my window, feeling more alone than I had since the day Grandma Helen died. She had trusted me to protect her house and her legacy, and my family was going to steal it all using lies and forged documents. But I was not going to give up. Not yet. Grandma Helen had not raised a quitter. The next morning I called in sick to work and spent 3 hours researching probate attorneys. I finally found one named Susan Chen who specialized in contested estates and had a reputation for being aggressive and thorough. Her consultation fee was $200 just to meet with her. I made an appointment for that afternoon. Susan's office was in a downtown high-rise with a view of the Willamette River. She was a woman in her early 50s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. I told her everything, showed her the will and Helen's letter, and explained about the forged power of attorney. Susan listened carefully, taking notes on a legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said this would not be easy. She charged $300 per hour and estimated I would need at least 50 hours of her time to fight this properly, probably more. That was $15,000 minimum, and could easily double if the case dragged on. I felt sick. I had maybe $8,000 in savings. I would have to drain my entire savings account and take out loans to afford her. But what choice did I have? Susan saw my face and said she understood this was a lot of money. She offered to work out a payment plan, but she needed a retainer of $5,000 to start. I agreed. I wrote her a check that represented more than half my savings and tried not to think about what would happen if we lost. Susan immediately filed motions with the probate court to challenge the power of attorney and to validate Helen's will. She requested all documentation related to the power of attorney, including the original signed documents. She also subpoenaed the notary, Julie, to give a deposition about the circumstances under which the power of attorney was supposedly signed. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then Julie's deposition arrived. I read it in Susan's office, my hands clenching the papers so hard they crumpled. Julie claimed she remembered the appointment clearly. She said Helen had seemed confused but aware enough to sign the documents. She said my mother had been present and had explained to Helen what the papers were for, and Helen had nodded and signed them. Julie described details about the meeting, what Helen had been wearing, what the weather was like that day. It was all lies. I knew it was lies, but it was convincing lies, told under oath. Susan sent me a copy of Julie's social media profiles that her investigator had pulled. Julie and Madison had been roommates in college. They were still close friends, frequently tagged in each other's photos at parties and wine tastings. Julie was not a neutral notary. She was someone who owed Madison a favor, but proving that Julie had committed perjury was another matter entirely. It was her word against mine, and she had a notary seal and official documents on her side. Then Susan got more bad news. She had requested the original power of attorney documents from the county records office. The office claimed the originals had been misplaced during a recent reorganization of their filing system. Only copies existed in the digital database. This was too convenient to be coincidence. Without the original documents, we could not conduct handwriting analysis to prove the signature was forged. We could not date the paper or ink. We had no physical evidence to work with. Susan suspected Trevor had used his connections in the construction and development industry to get to someone at the county records office. Trevor did work with the county regularly on permits and zoning issues. He knew people. He could make things disappear. While we were dealing with the power of attorney issue, my mother filed a separate lawsuit against the estate claiming I had exercised undue influence over Helen. She claimed I had manipulated an elderly woman with dementia into leaving everything to me by taking advantage of her deteriorating mental state. The lawsuit included an affidavit from a doctor named Richard Brennan, who claimed he had treated Helen for memory issues and cognitive decline in the last year of her life. According to his records, Helen had made multiple visits to his office complaining of confusion and forgetfulness. He had documented progressive dementia symptoms. I had never heard of Dr. Brennan. Helen had seen the same family doctor, Patricia Edwards, for over 30 years. I called Dr. Edwards and asked if she had ever referred Helen to a neurologist or memory specialist. She said absolutely not, that Helen had been in remarkably good health for her age and showed no signs of cognitive impairment. But Dr. Brennan's records looked official. They had dates and detailed notes about symptoms and medications prescribed. Susan said proving the records were fabricated would require expert testimony and possibly an investigation by the state medical board. More time, more money. I was hemorrhaging cash. Susan's bills were coming in every 2 weeks, each one larger than the last. I had burned through my savings and taken out a personal loan against my truck. I maxed out 2 credit cards just to stay afloat. Meanwhile, the house sat in legal limbo. Nobody could access it, sell it, or claim it while the probate case was ongoing. But the property taxes still needed to be paid, and maintenance costs were piling up. As the named beneficiary in the will, I was technically responsible for those costs. I was paying property taxes on a house I could not use and might lose. 4 months after this nightmare began, Trevor used his connections to file motions that further delayed the probate process. Every delay cost me more money in legal fees, while his family, backed by his wealth and Gerald's money, seemed to have unlimited resources. Then my mother made a calculated move. She instructed her lawyer to offer me a settlement. She would drop all legal challenges if I agreed to split the inheritance 3 ways. She framed it as being fair and what Helen would have wanted for the family to stay together. The settlement would give me about $300,000 after taxes and fees. It was more money than I had ever had in my life. I could pay off all my debts and still have plenty left over. But it felt like betraying Grandma Helen. She had explicitly wanted me to have the house and to protect it. She had known exactly what my mother and Madison would do, and she had tried to prevent it. I told Susan to reject the settlement. She warned me that I was taking a huge risk. If we went to trial and lost, I would get nothing and be buried in debt. But I could not shake the image of Grandma Helen's face, could not forget the trust she had placed in me. That night, someone broke into Grandma's house. I got a call from the Portland Police Department at 2 in the morning. When I arrived, I found the front door had been kicked in. The house had been vandalized. Windows were smashed. Walls had been spray-painted with obscenities. And someone had taken a sledgehammer to Helen's built-in bookshelves and the original hardwood floors. The damage was devastating. The house looked like a war zone. I walked through the rooms where I had spent so many happy hours with Helen and wanted to cry. This had been her sanctuary, and someone had desecrated it. The police took a report but said without witnesses or security cameras, there was little they could do. I called my insurance company to file a claim. The adjuster came out 3 days later, took photos, and denied the claim. The house had been listed as unoccupied, and I had not installed a security system or taken other measures to properly secure it. The vandalism was my responsibility. The repairs would cost over $50,000, money I absolutely did not have. I knew my mother and Madison were behind this. I had no proof, but I knew. They could not have the house, so they were destroying it piece by piece, making sure that even if I won, I would have nothing left worth winning. The legal battle consumed my life. Every waking moment was spent either working to pay Susan's fees or worrying about the case. I stopped seeing friends. I stopped doing anything that was not essential. My entire world narrowed to this fight. Susan filed motions arguing that the power of attorney was invalid, that Dr. Brennan's records were fabricated, and that Helen had been of sound mind when she made her will. But proving any of this required time and money I was running out of. 5 months into the battle, I got called into a meeting with my supervisor at work. Someone had filed an ethics complaint with the city claiming I had used my position as a civil engineer to illegally access confidential property records related to my grandmother's estate. The complaint alleged I had given myself an unfair advantage in the probate dispute by using city databases. It was completely false. I had never accessed any property records related to Helen's house through my work, but the complaint triggered a mandatory investigation by the city's ethics board. Standard procedure was to place the employee on unpaid administrative leave, pending the outcome of the investigation. My supervisor looked uncomfortable delivering this news. He said he personally did not believe the allegations, but his hands were tied. I was suspended without pay effective immediately. I knew instantly who was behind the complaint. Trevor had connections throughout city government and the construction industry. He had donated money to city council campaigns. He knew how to pull strings. Without my income and bleeding money on legal fees and property taxes and now vandalism repairs, I was headed for financial catastrophe. I applied for unemployment, but that would take weeks to process and would not be nearly enough to cover my expenses. My credit cards were maxed out. I had taken out a second loan, this one against my retirement account. I was drowning, and there was no life preserver in sight. Carol sensed weakness and increased the pressure. She spread rumors throughout our extended family that I had manipulated Helen and stolen from her. She told cousins and aunts and uncles that I was using the legal system to cheat my own mother out of her rightful inheritance. Family members I had known my whole life started avoiding me. At the grocery store, I ran into my cousin Amanda, who I had played with as a kid. She looked at me with disappointment and said she could not believe I would do this to my own mother. When I tried to explain, she walked away. Madison took things further. She created a Facebook post claiming I was abusing the legal system to steal from my family. She made me sound like a con artist who had preyed on an elderly woman. She shared the post publicly and tagged half of Portland in it. The post went viral in our local community. Hundreds of people shared it and left comments calling me greedy and heartless. Friends from high school saw it. Coworkers saw it. My reputation was destroyed by lies, but nobody wanted to hear the truth. They wanted to believe the dramatic story of a villain stealing from his poor mother. I stopped going out in public because I could not handle the stares and whispers. I had panic attacks in the grocery store. I felt like I was losing my mind. Then Susan called with news that made everything worse. She had learned that the judge assigned to our case was Martin Holloway, a 68-year-old jurist known for being extremely conservative in his interpretation of family law. Judge Holloway had a reputation for siding with parents in estate disputes. He believed that children, even adult children, had an obligation to respect their parents' wishes, and he tended to distrust younger beneficiaries who inherited large amounts. Susan had researched all of Judge Holloway's previous rulings in similar cases. In 8 out of 10 cases where a parent contested a will that favored a grandchild, he had ruled in favor of the parent. His written opinions often included language about the sanctity of the parent-child relationship and the importance of honoring parents. Susan estimated we now had less than a 30% chance of winning if the case went to trial. She strongly recommended I accept a settlement, even if it meant giving up most of the inheritance. She said half of something was better than all of nothing. I sat in her office, staring out at the river, and felt despair wash over me. I had fought so hard. I had sacrificed my savings, my job, my reputation. I had believed that truth and justice would prevail, but the system was rigged against me. That night I drove to Grandma Helen's house. I sat on the vandalized front porch in the dark and cried. I felt like I had failed her. She had trusted me with the most important thing in her life, and I was about to lose it to the very people she had tried to protect it from. I went inside with a flashlight and walked through the damaged rooms. In what used to be her bedroom, I found an old photo album that had somehow survived the vandalism, tucked away in a closet. I sat on the floor and opened it. The album was full of pictures spanning decades. Helen as a young teacher in the 1950s. Helen with her husband before he died. Helen with me as a child, helping me fly a kite in Laurelhurst Park. Tucked between the pages were letters. Not just any letters, but correspondence between Helen and her attorney Philip Morrison dating back 15 years. I read them by flashlight, hardly believing what I was seeing. The letters documented everything. Every time Carol had asked for money. Every time Madison had pressured Helen to sell the house. Every time they had treated her poorly or only visited when they wanted something. One letter from 8 months before Helen died described an incident where Carol had come over with documents she claimed were just healthcare directives. Carol had pressured Helen to sign them without reading them carefully. Helen had felt something was wrong and refused. She wrote that she suspected Carol was trying to trick her into signing over power of attorney or changing her will. Immediately after that incident, Helen had scheduled an appointment with Philip to make absolutely sure her will was ironclad and could not be challenged. The letters were dated and detailed. They provided a clear timeline that contradicted the forged power of attorney. If the power of attorney was supposedly signed 3 months before Helen's death, these letters proved Helen was still competent and aware of Carol's manipulations just 2 months before that alleged signing. I gathered all the letters and drove straight to Susan's office, even though it was past midnight. I called her cell phone from the parking lot. She answered, groggy and confused. But when I explained what I had found, she told me to come up. We spent the next 3 hours going through the letters. Susan's eyes got wider and wider as she read. This was the evidence we needed. This was proof that Helen had been of sound mind and that she had known exactly what she was doing when she made her will. But Carol's attorney argued the letters were hearsay and inadmissible. Susan filed motions, but Judge Holloway seemed reluctant to accept them as evidence. Then I remembered something else. Grandma Helen had been meticulous about documenting family events. She had boxes of old camcorder tapes from the 90s and 2000s. But in her final years, as technology changed, she had started using her smartphone to record voice memos about her daily life. I went back to the house and searched her bedroom more carefully. In a drawer of her nightstand, I found her old iPhone. The battery was dead, but I brought it home and charged it. When the phone powered up, I found dozens of voice memos. Helen had recorded herself talking about everything from grocery lists to memories from her childhood. And there, dated from the weeks before her death, were memos where Helen explicitly discussed her will. In one memo, she stated clearly that she was of sound mind and that she wanted me to have the house. She explained her reasoning, talking about how I was the only one who had truly cared for her. She mentioned her fears that Carol and Madison would challenge the will and try to steal the inheritance. In another memo from after the alleged date of the power of attorney, Helen talked about being approached by Carol with documents to sign. She said she had refused because she did not trust Carol's motives. She said she was glad she had already secured her will with Philip. The voice memos were dated and time-stamped automatically by the phone. They were recorded after the supposed signing of the power of attorney. This meant Helen could not have been incompetent enough to need a power of attorney if she was making these clear, coherent recordings about her own mental state and her wishes for her estate. I brought the phone to Susan. She listened to the memos and smiled for the first time in months. This was it. This was the smoking gun we needed. Susan filed emergency motions with the court and requested an expedited hearing. She argued that new evidence had come to light that definitively proved the power of attorney was forged and that Helen had been of sound mind. Judge Holloway agreed to hear the new evidence. A court date was set for 2 weeks away. But that night I received an anonymous text message on my phone. It said, "Drop the case or everyone will know what you did in college. The accusations will destroy what is left of your reputation. You think things are bad now? They can get so much worse." I felt ice in my stomach. Someone had been digging into my past, and I knew exactly what they had found. In my sophomore year of college, I had been falsely accused of plagiarism on a major paper. Another student had stolen my work and turned it in as his own, then claimed I had copied from him. It had been a nightmare that lasted an entire semester. I had eventually been cleared when the professor found the draft history on my laptop, proving I had written the paper first, but the accusation had stayed on my academic record as a notation even after I was exonerated. Carol was threatening to publicize that accusation and make it seem like I was guilty. She was going to paint me as a cheater and a fraud, someone who had a history of manipulating systems to get what he wanted. It would destroy what little reputation I had left. I stared at the text message, my hands shaking. I had a choice. I could drop the case, walk away from everything, and try to salvage some kind of life from the ruins. Or I could fight on, knowing my name would be dragged through the mud even more than it already had been. I thought about Grandma Helen, about the trust she had placed in me. I thought about her voice on those recordings, so clear and strong, talking about her wishes and her fears. I texted back, "Do your worst. I am not backing down." Then I blocked the number and tried to sleep, though sleep did not come. The 2 weeks before the hearing were the longest of my life. Every day I expected to see false accusations plastered across social media or in local news, but nothing happened. Maybe my mother had been bluffing. Maybe she realized that trying to destroy me further would backfire and make her look vindictive. Or maybe she was planning something worse. Susan worked around the clock, preparing for the hearing. She organized all the letters chronologically, had the voice recordings transcribed and authenticated by a digital forensics expert, and prepared a timeline that clearly showed Helen had been competent and aware right up until her death. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 9. I wore my only suit, which I had not worn since Helen's funeral. I felt like I was going to throw up. The courtroom was formal and intimidating, all wood paneling and high ceilings. Judge Holloway sat at his bench, looking stern and unapproachable. My mother and Madison sat on the other side of the courtroom with their attorney, a slick man in an expensive suit named Richard Kramer. Susan presented our case methodically. She entered the letters into evidence, explaining the timeline and how they contradicted the alleged power of attorney. She played the voice recordings for the court. Helen's voice filled the courtroom, clear and strong and utterly coherent, talking about her wishes and her fears and her love for me. I watched Judge Holloway's face as he listened. His expression did not change, but he was paying close attention. Then Susan called Julie, the notary, to the stand. Julie looked nervous, which was a good sign. Susan went through the details of Julie's previous deposition, having her repeat her story about witnessing Helen sign the power of attorney. Then Susan pulled out Julie's social media records. She showed photos of Julie and Madison together at parties, on vacations, at concerts. She established that Julie and Madison had been close friends for over 15 years. Susan asked Julie, directly, "Is it true you and Madison have been friends since college?" Julie hesitated, then admitted it was true. Susan asked, "Did Madison ask you to backdate documents and claim you witnessed Helen signing them when you never actually met Helen?" Richard Kramer objected loudly. Judge Holloway sustained the objection. But the question had been asked, and Julie's face had gone pale. Susan pressed on. She asked Julie to describe the room where the alleged signing took place. Julie gave details. Susan then showed photos of Helen's house, proving that the room Julie described did not match any room in Helen's home. Julie had never been there. Under the weight of the evidence and the threat of perjury charges, Julie broke down. She admitted through tears that Madison had asked her to notarize documents that had already been signed. She said she had not known what the documents were for, that Madison had told her it was just a formality for family paperwork. It was a lie, of course. Julie had known exactly what she was doing, but her admission was enough. The power of attorney was proven to be a fraud. Judge Holloway's face hardened. He asked Richard Kramer if he wanted to withdraw the power of attorney documents. Kramer, looking shaken, said he would need to consult with his clients. During a recess, I watched Carol and Madison argue in hushed whispers. Carol looked furious. Madison looked scared. Trevor stood nearby with his arms crossed, his face unreadable. When court resumed, Kramer announced they were withdrawing the power of attorney and the claim of undue influence. He tried to make it sound like a strategic decision, but everyone in the courtroom knew they had been caught. Judge Holloway was not happy. He stated for the record that forging legal documents and committing perjury were serious crimes. He said he would be referring the matter to the district attorney for potential criminal charges against both Madison and Julie. Then he validated Helen's will. The house, the trust, everything was legally mine. I felt a wave of relief so powerful I nearly collapsed. Susan squeezed my shoulder. After 6 months of hell, I had won. The house was mine. Grandma Helen's wishes would be honored. We left the courthouse into bright sunshine. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. I called Philip Morrison with the news. He was thrilled and said Helen would have been proud of me. That night I drove to Helen's house, my house now. I stood on the vandalized front porch and felt a mix of victory and sadness. The house was mine, but it was damaged and empty, and Helen was gone. I went inside, planning to start taking measurements for the repair work. The insurance company had agreed to reopen my claim now that the legal status of the house was settled. But as I walked through the front door, I smelled something wrong. something chemical and sharp. Then I heard a whooshing sound and felt a blast of heat. The back of the house was on fire. I ran outside and called 911. Flames were already visible through the kitchen windows, spreading fast. Fire trucks arrived within 10 minutes, but it was already too late. The fire had spread through the old wooden structure like it was made of paper. I stood on the sidewalk with neighbors gathered around me, watching Grandma Helen's house burn. Firefighters poured water onto the flames, but the house was over 100 years old with old wiring and dry wood. It was a total loss. By midnight, all that remained was a smoking ruin. The craftsman house that had sheltered 3 generations of my family was gone. All the built-in bookshelves, the original hardwood floors, the memories soaked into every room. Destroyed. The fire marshal determined it was arson. Someone had poured accelerant in multiple locations and set the house on fire deliberately. They suspected it had been set shortly before I arrived, timed so the house would be engulfed quickly. I had won in court, only to lose everything that mattered. The insurance investigation revealed something even worse. 2 weeks before the fire, someone had called the insurance company claiming to be me. They had requested the coverage be reduced to the minimum legally required by the county to save money on premiums. The insurance company had made the change without verifying the caller's identity beyond confirming basic information like my address and date of birth, information anyone could find online. The reduced policy meant the payout would barely cover the value of the land. There would not be nearly enough money to rebuild the house the way it had been. I knew Carol and Madison were behind both the arson and the insurance fraud, but I could not prove it. They had alibis. Gerald claimed he and Carol had been at dinner with friends. Trevor claimed he and Madison had been at a business conference in Seattle. The police investigated, but without evidence directly tying them to the fire, there was nothing they could do. Whoever had actually set the fire had been careful not to leave traces. I stood in the ashes of Grandma Helen's house and felt utterly defeated. I had won the legal battle but lost the war. The house was gone. Everything Helen had asked me to protect had been destroyed by the people she had feared most. My phone rang. I did not recognize the number. I almost did not answer, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice said, "Is this Chance?" I said it was. She said, "My name is Patricia Coleman. I am calling from First National Bank downtown. I am the senior safety deposit box manager. I have been trying to reach you for several days regarding a safety deposit box registered to Helen Anderson. According to our records, you are now the authorized accessor following her death. The box has been with us for 30 years and has never been opened. I am calling to see if you would like to schedule an appointment to access it." I stood there in the ruins of the house, phone to my ear, unable to speak. Patricia asked if I was still there. I said I was. I said I would be there first thing in the morning. I barely slept that night. I kept thinking about that safety deposit box. 30 years and never opened. What could possibly be in there? And why had nobody mentioned it before? I arrived at First National Bank when it opened at 9 the next morning. Patricia Coleman was a professional woman in her 50s who greeted me warmly. She led me through security doors and down to the vault, a room lined with metal boxes of various sizes. She explained that the safety deposit box had been rented in 1995. Helen had paid for it annually and had kept it current right up until her death. Patricia had tried calling the number on file after Helen passed, but it had been disconnected. She had finally located me through the probate records. Patricia used her master key and I used the key that had been in Helen's effects, which Philip Morrison had given me months ago. I had not known what the key was for until now. The box was large, one of the biggest sizes available. Patricia pulled it out and carried it to a private room where I could examine the contents alone. She left me there with the box and closed the door. My hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside was a thick manila envelope with my name written on it in Helen's handwriting. Below that were several other envelopes and folders. I opened the one with my name first. Inside was a letter dated 2 years before Helen's death. She had written, "To Chance, to be opened only after my passing, and only if you truly need it. If you are reading this, I hope it means you fought for what was right. What is inside this box is the truth about our family's finances and your future. I kept it secret because I knew Carol would stop at nothing to get her hands on it. Trust no one but yourself." My heart was pounding. I opened the next envelope and found financial statements from 3 different banks and investment firms. Account numbers, balances, transaction histories. Grandma Helen had been far wealthier than anyone had known. The statements showed investment accounts, bonds, stocks, and savings accounts that totaled over $4 million. The accounts had been quietly accumulating value for decades, drawing no attention because Helen lived so modestly on her teacher's pension. I flipped through the documents in disbelief. Helen had inherited money from her own parents, who had been frugal savers, and she had invested it wisely. She had worked with a financial advisor for over 40 years, letting the money grow while she lived simply. The accounts were all in my name, through irrevocable trusts that had been established 20 years ago, when I was a child. Carol and Madison had no legal claim to any of it. They did not even know it existed. I found another letter from Helen explaining everything. She wrote that she had watched Carol become increasingly greedy over the years. She had seen Madison grow into someone who valued money over people. She had known they would fight over the house if she left it to me, which is exactly what she wanted. The house was a test. Helen wrote that she needed me to see who my mother and sister truly were, to understand their nature so I would never feel obligated to them or guilty about cutting them out of my life. The house was bait, something valuable enough to make them reveal themselves. But the house was never the real inheritance. The money in these accounts was my true legacy. Helen apologized for putting me through the pain of the legal battle. She wrote that she had hoped it would not come to that maybe Carol would surprise her and do the right thing. But Helen had suspected it would go badly, which is why she had prepared this safety deposit box as insurance. She wrote, "The house was my heart, but this money is your future." I knew Carol would show her true nature fighting over the house. I am sorry you had to endure her cruelty, but now you know who she really is, and you are free from any obligation to her. Build your own life. Find people who love you for who you are, not what you can give them. You were the only one who loved me for me. I sat in that small room and cried. Helen had known. She had known everything that would happen, and she had prepared for it. Even now, months after her death, she was still protecting me. The letter continued with specific instructions. Helen had anticipated that Carol might try to destroy the house out of spite if she could not have it. She had secretly hired a professional photographer to document every detail of the house over the last 5 years of her life. The safety deposit box contained hundreds of high-resolution photos showing every room, every piece of original woodwork, every architectural detail. There were also the original architectural blueprints from when the house was built in 1923, and updated plans from renovations done over the decades. Helen had consulted with a historic preservation architect to create detailed specifications for how the house could be rebuilt exactly as it had been. She wrote, "If the house is destroyed, you have everything you need to rebuild it exactly as it was. Use some of the money in these accounts. Make it beautiful again. Make it a place where people feel loved and welcomed. That is what this house always was to me, and that is what I want it to be again." The final item in the box was a list of Helen's former students with notes about what had happened to them. Many had gone on to successful careers. Some had struggled, but made it through with Helen's support. She had impacted hundreds of lives during her teaching career. Helen's final instruction was, "Consider using some of this money to help others the way I tried to help my students. Not because you have to, but because you want to. That is the difference between you and Carol. You give because you care. She takes because she is empty inside." I gathered all the documents and took them to Susan's office. She reviewed everything and confirmed it was all legitimate. The trusts were ironclad. The money was mine, completely separate from the probate estate. Susan said I was now in a position to rebuild the house exactly as Helen wanted and still have enough left over to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I spent the next week thinking about what I wanted to do. The fire investigation had stalled. The police suspected Carol and Madison but had no hard evidence. Trevor's lawyer was arguing that my accusations were based on speculation and malice. I could have pressed charges. I could have used my resources to hire private investigators and build a case against them. I could have made their lives hell the way they had made mine hell. But I thought about what Helen had written. She had not raised me to seek revenge. She had raised me to be better than that. Instead, I made plans to rebuild the house, using Helen's photos and blueprints. I contacted a contractor who specialized in historic restoration. We would recreate the house exactly as it had been, using period-appropriate materials and techniques. But I would not live there. Instead, I would turn it into a community center and scholarship fund in Helen's name. I consulted with lawyers and accountants to set up a nonprofit foundation. The Helen Anderson Foundation would provide scholarships for underprivileged students pursuing education degrees, honoring Helen's legacy as a teacher. The rebuilt house would serve as a community center, offering free tutoring and mentoring programs for at-risk youth. I would fund it all with money from the trusts, ensuring the foundation could operate in perpetuity. When the plans were finalized, I decided it was time to face my family one last time. 6 months after Helen's death, I stood in a private dining room at a restaurant in downtown Portland. I had rented it for the evening and invited my mother, Madison, Gerald, Trevor, and several extended family members who had turned their backs on me during the legal battle. To my surprise, most of them came. Maybe they were curious. Maybe they felt guilty. Or maybe they just could not resist the chance to gloat about the destroyed house. I had spent months thinking about this moment, about what I would say and how I would say it. I had imagined dramatic confrontations and satisfying revenge. But standing there, looking at these people who shared my blood but not my values, I felt mostly sadness. Carol arrived first, wearing an expensive dress and a wary expression. Madison came next with Trevor, both of them dressed like they were attending a business function rather than a family dinner. Gerald looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to be anywhere else. We sat at a long table, the kind you see in movies about mob families, and for a while nobody spoke. A server brought wine and appetizers that nobody touched. Finally, Carol broke the silence. She said it was interesting that I had called this meeting, given everything that had happened. There was a challenge in her voice, like she expected me to accuse them of burning down the house. I took a sip of wine, collecting my thoughts. Then I began. I told them about the safety deposit box. I told them about the $4 million Helen had hidden away, about the trusts established in my name, about the financial legacy nobody had known existed. I watched their faces change as they realized how much money they had missed out on. Money they could never touch. Madison actually gasped. Trevor's jaw tightened. Carol's face went through a series of expressions from shock to anger to calculation, probably wondering if there was any legal angle left to pursue. I explained that Helen had been far smarter than any of them had given her credit for. She had known exactly what they would do, and she had planned accordingly. The house had been a test, and they had failed spectacularly. Then I told them about my plans for the foundation and the community center. I described how the house would be rebuilt exactly as it had been, how it would serve the community, how it would honor Helen's memory as an educator and as someone who believed in giving back. Carol found her voice. She said I was being self-righteous and judgmental. She said families fight over money all the time, and it does not make them bad people. She tried to frame their fraud and perjury and arson as normal family conflict. I let her finish. Then I said, "You tried to steal from me using forged documents. You committed perjury. You vandalized the house and then burned it down when you could not have it. These are not normal family conflicts. These are crimes. And they reveal who you really are." Madison stood up, her face red with anger. She said I had always thought I was better than everyone else, that I had manipulated Helen just like they had accused, that I did not deserve any of this. I stayed calm. I said, "The difference between us is that I loved Grandma for who she was. You loved her for what she had. I visited her every week because I enjoyed her company. You visited her when you needed money. I listened to her stories. You counted the days until she would die so you could sell her house." Trevor put a hand on Madison's arm, trying to get her to sit down and be quiet. But she shook him off. She said, "You think you are so noble, giving away all that money. You are just doing it for attention, to make yourself look good." I shook my head. I said, "I am doing it because it is what Helen would have wanted. She spent her life helping students. Now her legacy will continue helping students. Not because I want praise, but because it is right." I reached into my jacket and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a check for $50,000, the amount of the vandalism damage to the house. I slid it across the table to Carol. I said, "This is for you. It represents the cost of the damage you caused to the house when you had it vandalized. Consider it payment for teaching me exactly what kind of person I never want to become. I do not want your money, and I do not want your apology. I just want you to understand that we are done. Do not contact me. Do not come to the community center. You are not welcome in any part of my life or in anything connected to Helen's memory." Carol stared at the check like it was a snake. She did not touch it. I stood up to leave. I said, "Helen left me something more valuable than money or property. She taught me that family is not about blood. It is about love, respect, and showing up for people. She showed up for me my entire life. You never did. That is the real inheritance she gave me, and it is something you can never take away." I walked toward the door. Behind me, Carol called out that I would regret this, that I was making a mistake cutting them off, that family was supposed to forgive each other. I turned back one last time. I said, "Forgiveness is for people who are sorry. You are only sorry you got caught. There is a difference." Then I left. I walked out of that restaurant and got into my truck and drove away from that part of my life forever. Over the next year, I oversaw the reconstruction of Helen's house. The contractor did beautiful work, recreating every detail exactly as it had been. We used the original blueprints and Helen's photographs to ensure authenticity. We salvaged what little material could be recovered from the fire, incorporating charred bricks into a memorial garden. The Helen Anderson Community Center opened on what would have been her 88th birthday. Former students of hers came from across the country to attend. They shared stories about how Helen had believed in them when nobody else did, how she had stayed after school to help them with homework, how she had loaned them money for college textbooks, how she had attended their graduations and weddings. I realized that Helen's true legacy was not the house or the money. It was the hundreds of lives she had touched, the students she had inspired, the difference she had made in the world through simple acts of kindness and dedication. The foundation began awarding scholarships to students pursuing education degrees. In the first year, we helped 20 young people attend college who otherwise could not have afforded it. The community center offered free tutoring every afternoon, staffed by volunteer teachers who had been inspired by Helen's example. I moved into a modest apartment near the community center. I did not need a big house or expensive things. I had everything I needed: meaningful work, a sense of purpose, and the knowledge that I had honored Helen's wishes. The district attorney eventually declined to press criminal charges against Carol and Madison. Julie the notary faced consequences for notary fraud but got off with probation. Trevor's connection to the arson was never proven. Justice was incomplete. But I found I did not care as much as I thought I would. I had learned something important through this whole ordeal. Revenge and punishment were not as satisfying as building something positive. Making my enemies suffer would not bring Helen back or heal my pain. But helping students pursue their dreams, that was something that mattered. 2 years after Helen's death, I attended the graduation of the first scholarship recipient from the foundation. Her name was Angela, and she was the first person in her family to graduate from college. She was going to teach elementary school in a low-income district. At the ceremony, Angela thanked the foundation in her speech. She talked about how the scholarship had changed her life, how it had given her opportunities she never thought possible. She said she wanted to be the kind of teacher who made a difference in kids' lives, the way someone named Helen Anderson had once made a difference. I sat in the audience with tears running down my face. This was Helen's real legacy. This was what she had wanted. Not a house that would eventually crumble, but a ripple effect of kindness and education spreading outward through time. I never spoke to my mother or sister again. I heard through extended family that Madison and Trevor had divorced. Apparently the stress of the legal battles and investigations had destroyed their marriage. Carol had grown bitter and isolated, having alienated most of the family with her behavior. I felt no satisfaction in their struggles. I felt nothing at all about them. They had become strangers, people I used to know in another life. I had learned the most important lesson Helen had tried to teach me. Sometimes winning is not about defeating your enemies. It is about becoming someone they can never touch, no matter how hard they try. I had lost the physical house, but gained something far more valuable. I had gained myself. I had learned who I was and what I valued, and what kind of person I wanted to be. I had learned that integrity and purpose mattered more than money or revenge. Family, I realized, was not defined by blood but by love and respect. Helen had been more of a parent to me than my own mother ever was. The students we helped through the foundation, the volunteers at the community center, the people who believed in what we were building, they became my family. Every year on Helen's birthday, I stood at her grave and told her about the foundation, about the students we had helped, about the community center and all the kids who used it. I told her that I had kept my promise. The house might be gone, but what it represented, what it stood for, lived on in a new form. Material possessions can be destroyed, but integrity and character and purpose cannot. The greatest revenge is not destruction, but building something beautiful from the ashes of betrayal. As I stood at Helen's grave on what would have been her 90th birthday, looking at the community center visible in the distance, I whispered, "I kept my promise, Grandma. The house might be gone, but what it stood for will live forever." And I knew somehow that she could hear me, that she was proud, that everything she had done had been worth it. The life lesson was clear and powerful. Family is built through love and respect, not blood. Our actions define us, not our circumstances. And the best way to honor those who believed in us is not by seeking revenge on those who wronged us, but by building something meaningful that outlasts us all. I had thought this story would end with me defeating my enemies. Instead, it ended with me realizing I did not need to defeat them. I just needed to become someone they could never be, someone Helen would be proud of, someone who carried forward her legacy of kindness and education and genuine care for others. That was the real victory. That was the real inheritance, and it was something nobody could ever take away. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between revenge and building something positive? Have you faced betrayal from family members and had to decide how to respond? What would you have done in my situation? Would you have fought back or walked away? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you or made you think about the meaning of family and legacy, please hit the like button. Subscribe to hear more stories about real people facing difficult choices and finding their way through. And share this with someone who needs to hear that sometimes the best revenge is living well and building something meaningful. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it reminds you that your worth is not determined by how others treat you, but by how you choose to respond. May you find the strength to walk away from those who diminish you and the courage to build something beautiful in spite of them.